They are John Campner, the author, broadcaster and executive director of the UK in the World project at Chatham House. I knew him when he was a slip of a boy as political editor at the New Statesman. How long ago was that? 20 years, wasn't it?
Something exactly like that. 2002, 2005, and then I edited it after that. Yes, and Kate Hoey I've just done a spoiler for you, but she said to me rather leadingly, "You've changed."
You haven't changed a bit. As you say, you've spoilt my thunder here because Kate Hoey is with us, former Labour MP for Vauxhall, former Minister and now life peer in the House of Lords, sits on the crossbenches, I think. Baroness Natalie Bennett, she is Green Party member of the House of Lords, former party leader. Good to see you again, Natalie.
Lovely to be back.
And Phoebe Arslanagic-Wakefield is a senior research fellow at Bright Blue and chair of the Women in Think Tanks Forum. They are here to take your calls, 0345 6060 973, and of course you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first question. It's yet another question from Watford. We seem to get loads of questions from Watford on this programme. We're big in Watford. Terry, what would you like to ask? Hello.
Hi, Ian. Hi, everyone. My question is, has the government misread the public mood regarding the rail strike?
That's an interesting one because there were two polls out today, one from YouGov, one from Savanta, that one said that the public supported the strike and one said the public didn't. And it was quite narrow margins either way. Kate Hoey.
Well, actually, I said last night in the House of Lords when we had a statement that I felt the government had misjudged not getting more involved. Now, of course, behind the scenes, perhaps they are, but the reality is it looks like they've been almost afraid, perhaps a bit exaggerated, to meet officially the union. And I said last night that, it's all very well calling the RMT pariahs, and because the RMTs called the government more or less pariahs, but that's not showing much respect for the individual members of the RMT. So I don't understand why they haven't been able to simply ask the leaders into Downing Street. Yes, of course.
Can you remember the last time that happened?
A long, long time ago. But, I'm just thinking really, I think the whole thing would have been handled very differently if we'd had still, he's a relatively new leader of the RMT. He's not like Bob Crow. He doesn't have the kind of personality to sort of come on television and really make people feel that absolutely he's got the right, that they're doing it for the right reasons. So
I think you're underestimating him, actually. He sat in that chair about 3 weeks ago for an hour taking calls from listeners.
Good.
And most of the feedback from people was, well, he convinced me.
Yeah, well, that's fine. He doesn't convince me the way someone like Bob Crow would have done, I have to be honest. But I still think the government...
You're still at heart of your lefty, aren't you?
Well, no, I like Bob Crow. I think he had a huge personality. And behind the scenes, he was actually very good at, working for his members. He wasn't out to set a revolution, even if though he personally wanted one.
I always remember interviewing Bob Crow as one of the most difficult people to interview because he would always be interviewed in a pub where he knew that all the background noise meant that he could just carry on speaking because you couldn't interrupt him because he wouldn't be able to hear you properly.
But I think the government has misjudged it, and I think after these 3 days they're going to have to show a little bit more definite engagement publicly.
Phoebe.
Well, have the government misjudged it? I think the government's, to some extent, been enjoying the sticky political situation that's put Keir Starmer in. Remains to be seen whether or not that's a misjudgment. I think the public are divided because, actually, they understand that strikers are striking in order to, try and cope with the cost of living crisis, which is causing economic pain for everyone. But at the same time, they do want to be able to get to work.
So do you think that depends, your ability to get about your normal business probably defines your attitude to this dispute?
Well, I have seen polling today from the New Statesman, which said that those aged 18 to 24, coincidentally the demographic least likely to take the train, is also that most supportive of the strikers. So perhaps something there.
John?
Well, Boris Johnson, ever the opportunist, is very lucky in finding a wedge issue. It's something that has, as Phoebe has just alluded to, is causing Keir Starmer greater discomfort at the moment in narrow political terms. with many of his MPs, or several of them, defying his order not to go onto picket lines and not publicly to support the strikes. On the one hand, it's another classic case where it's as much about Starmer as it is about anybody else, and it shouldn't be. On the other
But he's made it about him, hasn't he, with this order to his front bench not to appear on picket lines.
It's stupid.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the sort of classic always learning from the previous election, bar 3 or 4, which is this sort of whatever we are, we've got to be as close as mimic the sort of Tony Blair approach to sort of triangulation, which may have worked for that time, but that has long ago been rumbled. It's all about being authentic, and this idea that however you want to move away from Jeremy Corbyn and refashion the Labour Party, that is fine. But for the Labour Party, just almost on a sort of neurotic instinct to sort of say, here's a strike, oh my God, here's working people, oh my God, we can't do this because, what will the Daily Mail think of it, just seems to be really self-defeating policies, and that's not where the Labour Party is going to benefit. That said, I mean, as Kate was saying, the fact that this government is almost sort of giving the impression of luxuriating in this mess, partly because it wins some points, as I say, about Keir Starmer. How is that actually going to play? I mean, we've got the worst performing economy in the G7, the second worst performing economy in the OECD, apart from that brilliant bastion of everything, Russia. It's not a good look in this country to be seen to be scoring cheap political points off other people's misfortune.
Natalie Bennett, let's remind ourselves of Terry's question. Has the government misread the mood on this rail strike?
I think Terry's absolutely right, and I think John is particularly right in focusing on the government's problem with its own behaviour. Of course, the Labour Party has got itself into a tangle, but the government is also in a tangle. If you look at the way it's approaching this, it's clearly playing the politics of division, the culture war. This is really obvious to voters, and it's very obvious to us in Parliament. Kate and I were in the rail statement last night, and this was gleeful, childish, talking about union barons and using.
Is this really any different to any other industrial dispute? Because we haven't actually had many over the past 10 or 15 years, so maybe we've got unused to this kind of language.
But I think what's happening is this is very typical language of the way a government approaches everything. I mean, I've got Hansard here and Baroness Veer, who was answering in the House, said,
The sure way to send our listeners to sleep reading out Hansard.
It sets out exactly how the government feels about this. I don't think people want the government to feel about things.
She's quite moderate, isn't she? She's not a rabble-rouser.
Oh, I think if you listen to her repeating Grant Shapps' statement last night, it was very much playing that kind of way.
Is that what they do? They repeat word for word?
They read it out. Yeah, and if we think about Conservative long-time voters who are turning away from the Conservative Party now, people who don't like the Conservative Party that now looks like the Brexit Party or the UKIP Party. It's those core Conservative voters that want the government to be the grown-ups, not the people in the room throwing fuel on the fire, which is very clearly what the government's doing. And so they're really turning off their core voters. So it's once more this strategy of chasing the 30%, but it's abandoning lots of people who've been long-time Tory voters, which, given we've got 2 by-elections this week, may turn out to be definitely a shooting yourself sort of strategy.
I mean, I think Wakefield, we all know what's going to happen in that one. But the other one in Honiton and Tiverton, I keep receiving very, very different information depending on who you talk to, from whether it's a Liberal Democrat or a Tory. The Tories say, no, we've lost it, but it's gone. And the Liberal Democrats say, oh, no, I don't think we're going to do it. So you can never really judge what's going to happen in by-elections from the political parties. But in terms of how to bring this dispute to a resolution, I said to Kate, I can't remember a Prime Minister really ever since Jim Callaghan or Harold Wilson asking the unions into Downing Street to solve an industrial dispute. Ken Livingstone never did it when he was in dispute with the RMT or ASLEF, did he?
But what we have is reports from the rail bosses saying we're not being allowed to talk constructively with the unions because it's the government that controls the purse strings. It is effectively now the government controlling the railways. And if they're not able to negotiate, it has to be the government that moves on this. And, of course, it's not just rail workers. We're going to be seeing the same situations arising with nurses, with teachers, and the money to give those people, they're already struggling to survive, put food on the table, keep a roof over their head. For them to be able to get the kind of pay rises they need in this inflation environment, the money has to come from the Treasury.
Let's bring in Simon in Orpington. Terry, thank you for that, because it's a sort of allied question. We've touched on it already. Simon, hello, go ahead.
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for taking my call, Iain, and good evening, panel. In light of Keir Starmer telling his MPs not to go anywhere near the picket line, and two of them have today, does this play into Boris Johnson's hands?
John Campner.
Yes, and as we were just saying before, and it's a good question. Labour is always giving the impression of trying to define itself by what it isn't, than rather what it is. I could cite a whole series of policy areas where I think that would apply to Keir Starmer in his increasingly, not desperate isn't the quite word, but just sort of almost messianic desire that whatever Jeremy Corbyn stood for, he has to go against that. And the opinion polls on this are important. They're not decisive. You should, as a politician, never just follow whichever opinion polls are out at any given time. But as we've all been discussing, public opinion on this is nuanced. Of course, it's going to change. The longer this lasts, I'm sure that the more public will get frustrated and angry, particularly with the union, but more generally with all the parties in the dispute. But Starmer, I just can't see. And also, if you are going to impose restrictions on your MPs, your employees, whatever, you've got to be able then to have the determination to carry them out. So is he now going to punish, remove the whip or do whatever to a whole series of...
I think the Chief Whip has said he'll make that decision after the strikes are finished on Saturday. Kate Hoey.
Well, all during my time as a Member of Parliament for 30 years, there were all sorts of strikes, and I had Waterloo in my constituency. We were never told under Tony Blair, under any other leader that I remember, telling us not to go on picket lines. I mean, that was left up to individual members of Parliament to make up their own minds about their relationship with local branches. Quite often MPs have relationships with trade unions locally. They've been involved with them in different ways, and it was seen as quite normal to go along, and particularly, for example, I had a very good relationship with the UCW and then the CWU, and I would have gone along to picket lines. So I think it was rather silly of him, because it wasn't even try. He didn't even try to do it secretly. Well, of course, that wouldn't have worked because nothing's secret. But he could have sort of put it around to informally to people that maybe it might not be a good idea, or they could have discussed it at Shadow Cabinet. But to come out with something like that was bound to have people oppose it.
Natalie?
I think what we've got is a repeat of 2015. I was there at the coalface then with Ed Miliband, which is, if I just don't offend anyone and try and follow the opinion polls and sit on as many fences as I can find, then the keys to number 10 will fall into my lap. We saw how that worked out. I believe politics is about standing up for what you believe in, for setting out your principles. In the Greens, we believe very much in trade union rights. We have some of the most repressive trade union legislation in Europe, where the government's talking about more, and standing up for people's right to strike, right to defend their pay conditions and safety. That should be a principle you would have thought of anything politics you might call progressive.
Abby says, is Keir Starmer a hopeless leader, or has he just got bad advisers and needs to get rid of them as soon as possible if Labour hopes to win the next election? Well, Phoebe, as the old saying goes, advisers advise, leaders decide.
Yes, and in this instance, as Kate was saying, the line in the sand that Keir has chosen to draw on is a very strange one, very difficult to enforce, leaves him in a very difficult situation. Now the political story is whether or not he's going to discipline people like people who are prominent in the shadow cabinet. And also, really sadly, it just hasn't really worked as a way of evading the.
To be fair, none of the shadow cabinet have appeared on picket lines. It's just junior shadow spokespeople.
But, it's not prevented Tory MPs and other people from tweeting out things like, cheers, Keir. with stories about the strikes. So it's not really worked. And actually, the majority of Labour voters support the strikes, and people are very confused about what Labour's position is. I saw polling today which said that 43% of people don't know what Labour's position is on the strikes.
Natalie?
Well, I think it's worth, noting that, because I stood against Keir Starmer in Holborn and St Pancras in 2015.
I was wondering what you meant by that. Yeah, so I remember now.
And I mean, that was when he first came into politics.
That's my constituency.
So he hasn't really been in politics that long. And I think sometimes that really shows.
Couple of texts and tweets here. George says, Mick Lynch has been wiping the floor with the media and every Tory minister he's come up against. He's made Chris Philp look like an idiot last night. Did the same to Kay Burley this morning. No comment. And somebody else says, Iain, how do you find time to do cross-question and run the RMT? Because apparently I am Mick Lynch's looky-likey, as well as the Archbishop of York. Jonathan says, Natalie, I think I'm far better looking than either of those, but there we go. I was waiting for one of you to say that, but you didn't. Natalie, I'm voting for the Conservatives because they're more like the Brexit Party, and I don't think I'm alone, says Jonathan in Dulwich. And Jeff in Ipswich says, very left-wing biased presenter tonight. Surprising.
Oh, God. You've been accused of many things in your time, Iain, but being an RMT representative.
Increasingly accused of being left-wing, John. There we go. How times change, eh? We'll come to more of your questions in a moment. Simon, thank you very much for that. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
I just
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 20 past 8. John Kampfner from Chatham House joins us. Baroness Kate Hoey, Baroness Natalie Bennett. I think we ought to have a whole show of baronesses at one point. I get Julie Andrews in. And Phoebe Arslanagic-Wakefield, who's from the Bright Blue think tank. Right, let's go to our next caller. It's Tony in Enniskillen in Northern Ireland. Hello, Tony.
Good evening, and thanks for taking my question.
Hi.
I'd just like to, with all these strikes and everything, I'd just like to ask, do the panel support politicians going on strike?
Anyone's in mind particularly that you'd like to go on strike?
The road from me, so I think you can guess it's the DUP.
Okay. John Kampfner, let's start with you.
They shouldn't be. They should be, if you believe in the democratic process, if you were perfectly, if not comfortable, you were attuned to the idea of Sinn Féin being in your government with the deputy First Minister. So when the roles reverse, which is out of your hands, that's in the hands of the ballot box, you should do just that thing. You should go into government, because if you selectively apply the democratic process, you are nowhere.
Kate Hoey, you understand the meaning behind Tony's question. Do you support the DUP in their boycott of?
Well, first of all, remember, Sinn Féin boycotted for 3 years, and I don't remember it getting hardly any publicity for about the first 2 years when nothing happened. So they were on strike, I suppose, for 3 years. The DUP is if you want to use that expression, been out on strike for the last sort of 8 weeks or so. Of course, they're all still doing their constituency work, so they will say they're not doing the work, but of course they're not actually in government. I have to say the DUP did get a very clear mandate in the sense that they had that very clearly in the election. It's not about Sinn Féin being First Minister or anything like that. It's about the protocol, and they made it very clear.
Convenient excuse,
They made it very clear. No, I don't think it is, but I think they genuinely made it very clear that they would not go back into the executive until the protocol had changed. And there's no doubt about it, whatever the government may say and Brandon may say, the fact that there is no sitting executive has meant that the government has had to move. It may have been talking about legislation, and it has been for some time, but it's actually now at least got its first reading. I mean, whether it gets its second reading or not, because I understand that there is some.
This is the legacy bill.
The legacy, the bill on the protocol.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that got its first reading. It's quite a good, detailed bill. Obviously, there are bits in it that people will want to change, but it needs to get on with it, because I don't think we'll see any executive.
I'm going to remove your piece of paper because it's crackling
any
into the
executive
microphone.
restored. I don't think we'll see any executive restored until at the very least, the second reading of that bill is through. And then, of course, there needs to be some guarantee from the government that they're going to really try and get it through the Lords.
But isn't this...
Are you really... Sorry, I just want to ask, are you really saying it's got nothing to do with the protocol, and it's just simply... so that it has everything to do with the protocol, and it's got nothing to do with the fact that the DUP could not countenance the idea of being deputies to a Sinn Féin government?
No, because, as you know, the reality is it makes no difference. Nobody can even put a stamp on a letter without the two of them agreeing. So it makes no difference. Of course, psychologically, First Minister, although when Sinn Féin were Deputy First Minister, they always wanted to call it Joint Minister. So I think, there's a bit of, I can understand that's, for media to think that that's a really big shift. Actually, overall, in terms of overall votes, the Unionist votes were still very greater than the nationalist votes in terms of whether they're any kind of United Ireland poll and all of that. But coming back to the issue, the protocol will have to go before there will be a functioning executive. In the meantime, most of the money, most of the things that happen in Northern Ireland is coming from the United Kingdom government anyway, and things will continue to operate. We had 3 years and the health service still operated. I don't think anything that the bad things that are happening in terms of cost of living and all of that, an executive sitting there tomorrow won't actually make much difference.
Phoebe.
I don't know much about the situation. It sounds like the tactic has been somewhat successful, but ultimately it is a matter of democratic representation, and I think it would be unacceptable to let it stretch out for as long as 3 years, and I do hope it'll be resolved a lot sooner than that.
I agree.
I think what would happen if politicians in mainland Britain did this and said, well, no, we're not going to join, we're not going to form a government or become deputy because of one piece of legislation. And there would be public outcry in England if that happened.
You can't really get a scenario. You give me an example.
I know it's difficult.
This is about the constitutional position of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, which has been without consent of the people in Northern Ireland, without any single unionist politician from any of the parties supporting it, being put through wrongly, accepted now by government that it was wrongly put through, and we know all the reasons, and Lord Frost has gone into that.
The electorate voted for a majority of MLAs who support the protocol.
And the electorate voted to remain in the European Union.
That's irrelevant. I mean, I'm surprised at you as someone from the Chatham House actually not remembering that the referendum on the leaving the European Union was a United Kingdom referendum. I do presume you do believe believe in the United Kingdom at Chatham House.
I do, Kate, and I also think it is interesting, is it not, when you look at Scotland and when you look at Northern Ireland, that you had
what about
that
Wales,
result.
who voted to leave?
Absolutely, Wales voted to leave, yeah, and England did too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, on that bombshell, Natalie.
Coming back to Tony's question about going on strike, I mean, I think people in Northern Ireland are obviously, as you rightly say, Iain, the majority of them voted for politicians who backed the protocol. So it's a very strange situation that way. But also, Northern Ireland has long suffered from some of the worst levels of poverty across the United Kingdom.
It's doing fantastically well at the moment. I mean, economically, it's the fastest growing part of the United Kingdom.
There we get into the question of economic growth and who's it going to, and what's the situation of so many people in society who are struggling to put food on the table, keep a roof over their head. I don't believe in chasing economic growth, and I don't think economic growth is a good measure of people's well-being.
You're only going to put food on the table if you have economic growth. If you have a shrinking economy, that's bad for poorer people.
If you have a redistribution of wealth so that you don't have bankers collecting record levels of bonuses as they are now, you don't have CEOs of water companies that were being mentioned in the House today. Jenny Jones, my fellow Green peer, was talking about huge dividends going from water companies to the owners, the privatised water companies. There is plenty of resources in the UK for everyone to have a decent life if we share them out fairly, which is also true on a global scale. So just taking GDP growth and saying everything's fine doesn't add up.
Let's elect a communist government then.
Let's elect a Green government that wants to ensure that everyone can put food on the table, keep a roof over their head, has a universal basic income.
But surely,
and we have a 10-to-1 ratio. The top paid person in an organisation can't be paid more than 10 times the lowest paid person.
I mean, we're going off the subject here a bit, but it's quite enjoyable, so let's continue with it. But isn't this the problem for the Green Party, where you're right that you don't want economic growth, but you still think that there ought to be more resources? Fine, you can tax a few bankers a bit more and all the rest of it, but you're never going to come up with the billions that would be needed to achieve your policy aims without economic growth.
No, well, I can point you to the 2019 Green Party manifesto that showed how we were going to do all of this. And the fact is...
and how many MPs did you get? One.
If you look at the last fair vote that we had in the UK, i.e. a proportional vote where the result reflected the views of the people, which was the European election, we got 11% of the vote.
And the others got 89.
And we beat the Conservative Party, the party of government.
And in the Brexit referendum, 52-48, that was a democratic vote, wasn't it? The people got what they wanted there.
I think the question with the people of what kind of Brexit was never answered, and that's why coming back to bring this back to the question from Tony that we started from.
Please do.
I actually was at Greenbelt, the Christian Glastonbury Festival, a year or so after the Brexit vote, and
who was singing there? Cliff Richard.
I don't recall who was singing. I was talking at lots of things about social fairness, international development, etc. But people asked, what about the Northern Ireland question? What's the answer to the Northern Ireland question? And I said, there is no answer. There has to be a border somewhere. And there still is no answer to the Northern Ireland question with Brexit.
Well, why should it be dividing up the United Kingdom? If it's such a need for a border, then the EU need to be protecting their internal market. They should be responsible for it.
John?
Just very quickly on that, and obviously we could go on forever about that and about the Northern Ireland Protocol, but there's just a basic rule in international relations, which is when you willingly sign, in fact, you produce an international agreement. Nobody has put a gun to your head. You've had all the legal advice, you've had all the other forms of advice and trade advice that you could possibly have, and you go through every single hoop possible, happily to sign it, and then you think, maybe it wasn't such a good idea after all, I'm going to tear it up. That's one thing, you can take that decision, but what that does and we're doing a lot of work on this question of what is Britain's place in the world, what is Britain's reputation in the world, what's its locus, and it's fine if you want to be seen as a disruptive power, but it's quite something else if you lose that sense of being seen as a reliable partner, and that what you sign is your word is your bond, and Britain is losing that. And whenever now Britain goes into discussions and negotiations and says, well, we stand for this, there are quite often two responses. One is, well, that's what you say today. What are you going to do tomorrow? And the other is, please don't lecture us about the furtherance of international law because you don't follow it. And that's a real problem.
First of all, it's really important to remind listeners that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement is an international agreement as well. So when they're in conflict, clearly a government has to stick up for its own citizens. And the reality, of course, too, is that, there are many, many people around.
But that
and you sound like them, John. Just read the report that's come out today that Iain Duncan-Smith's been involved with. You sound exactly like those kind of people who always, never, ever want to be praising the United Kingdom, raising it up. No, you want to always look like we're the country that's being
I want us to be seen as a great paragon of international relations and of reliability.
But John,
and
what do you do? What do you do as a government when, okay, you're absolutely right in what you said about they've signed the deal, no one forced them to, they signed it.
And that dilemma that Kate points to existed when they signed it.
It's in the protocol that it can be looked at and changed.
Well, that is also true. And when it is demonstrably shown that an agreement isn't working, it's not unreasonable for someone to say, well, look, this isn't working for the following reasons. Can we please look at how we can make it work better? And actually, to be fair, all of the political parties in Northern Ireland
want to change it
in some way, to one degree or another. So you think, well, what is the agenda of the European Commission in not wanting to negotiate?
Look, I'm not arguing for the European Commission. I'm not arguing for anything. I'm arguing for Britain's reputation in the world, which matters enormously when we are as we're doing very good work with regard to Ukraine and Russia's invasion. We are rightly very strongly praised for that, and I absolutely praise our response since February the 24th. But you have to be consistent in the application of international law.
Right, we're going to move on. As you say, all of you, we could continue with that for the rest of the hour, but lots of other subjects. We haven't talked about Ukraine very much over the past couple of weeks. It seems to have disappeared down the news agenda a little bit. If you'd like to ask a question on that, or indeed anything else, 0345 6060 973. Abby in Surrey says, Iain, you are neither left-wing nor right-wing, mostly fair and empathetic. Here's the killer, though, except when it comes to Brexit, when you turn into Dr. Jekyll's monster. It's 8:33, news headlines with Serena Farrow.
A cabinet minister has told LBC the government takes no responsibility for rail strikes, but the opposition should. Universities Minister Michelle Donlan has criticised some Labour MPs for joining picket lines. A man's been arrested after a woman and child was stabbed to death in Barnet in North London. Police believe the 37 and 5-year-old are a mother and son and were known to the suspect. And as a litre of unleaded petrol now costs £1.88 on average, it's hoped prices will be reduced soon. The RAC wants retailers to pass falling wholesale costs on to drivers. Diesel's likely to keep increasing, though, towards £2 a litre. LBC weather staying mostly dry across the UK tonight, largely clear in England and Wales as well. A little bit cloudy, though, for eastern and southern Scotland, with a low of 8 degrees.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:35 on LBC. John Kampfner is here. He's director of the UK in the World project at Chatham House. Now, just tell us a little bit about that, John.
So we set it up. It's really interesting. Chatham House sort of seen to be very much sort of part of the British establishment. St James's Square, right at the heart of Piccadilly, hasn't
sort of the foreign policy Russie, isn't it?
Yeah, that's one way.
Or they're the defence policy.
That's a very wonky way of calling it, which I'm not sure would necessarily resonate with listeners. But I mean, it's right in the heart of London. You could call it the establishment, but actually, it hasn't had for as long as anybody can remember, a dedicated programme looking at the UK. It deals with the whole world. And given that the world is in so much turbulence, some of which you could argue we have caused ourselves, but the vast majority of which is just happening, we thought it would be a really good opportunity. Obviously, you've got to comment on all the day-to-day stuff. We've been talking about Northern Ireland Protocol, talk about Ukraine, whatever. But it's really trying to chart what is Britain going to look like? What is it going to, what do people want around the world of Britain? What will be its strengths and its weaknesses? What will be its capabilities over the next 5 or 10 years? It's trying to do some new thinking on what our foreign policy will be.
Kate Hoey is here too, former Labour MP for Vauxhall, former Minister, now life peer in the House of Lords, former Green Party leader Baroness Natalie Bennett, and Phoebe Arslanagic. I knew I would do that at some point this hour, so this is it. Phoebe Arslanagic-Wakefield,
well done.
From the Bright Blue think tank. Can't even pronounce the think tank right. Right, let's hastily move on to our next question. It's John in Slough. Hello, John.
Good evening. I'm actually in Gerrard's Cross, which is near Slough.
That's very important.
Thank you for taking my question. My question is this. I'm a retired professional. Back in the 80s, I was working in South America, in Uruguay. They had horrific inflation. People were going bankrupt. They couldn't afford food. What the government did is they introduced a 3-month review linked to inflation. It worked, people survived, and they managed to eat and live decently. Why cannot the government do that here, either on a 3, 4, or 5, 6-month basis, which would affect all civil servants? Thank you.
Was it just for government workers?
It was civil servants, but it also related to other allied professions like railway engineers.
Right, so sort of, in a way, well, let's start with you, Natalie Bennett. This would be quite divisive, wouldn't it? It would set worker against worker.
Well, I think what we've got to do is look at more of the deepest underlying structural things with inflation. And what we are now in, one of the immediate causes is, of course, the Ukraine war, the impact on energy prices. But we also we're in the age of shocks. The supply chain is in a state of considerable turmoil and continuing turmoil. We're looking at all of the dreadful climate events that are happening all around the world, which is having huge impacts on food security, on food production. So what we're seeing is there's real shortages and real disruption, and that's one of the significant things that's pushing inflation.
Do you see this as a long-term thing? Because you talk to government ministers, and they sort of, I think, more in hope than expectation, but they hope that it'll be over within 12 months.
Well, I think if we are in the age of shocks. The Russian attack on Ukraine, COVID, Brexit was a shock in its own right, the financial crash. And there's lots of instability in the financial markets at the moment. The idea we're going to come to some sort of, smooth running, immediate, smoothness in politics. If we go back to sort of 2006 when I joined the Green Party, and, this was, remember, when Gordon Brown had abolished boom and bust, and you knocked on people's doors and said things have got to change. And they said, everything's going swimmingly, and the financial sector is going to ensure that Britain's prosperity is guaranteed forever. We're not going to have stability anytime soon. We have a profoundly destabilised world. We're coming to the end of the neoliberal era. The neo-Thatcherite, neo-Reaganite economic model has broken down, and there's going to be a lot of change in a world that's profoundly climate disrupted, in which nature is falling apart.
It's a good book title, Coping with the Age of Shock. There's a new one for you, John. Phoebe?
Well, I guess two things about John's suggestion. First of all, I'm not really sure why a pay review like that for public sector workers wouldn't contribute to that inflationary wage price spiral, particularly thinking about just how many people are employed by the public sector. And the second thing is, junior people employed in the private sector tend to be worse paid than junior people employed in the public sector. So that would actually, there's a huge tranche of people who this measure wouldn't really help. So those are my two main queries with it, really.
Kate?
Yes, I think Phoebe's right that, the poorest in our society tend to be people working in unorganised jobs where there's no trade unions, at the very sort of bottom of the heap. And most people think, probably wrongly in terms of every public sector worker, but most people think public sector workers on the whole have good working conditions, good reasonable wages, and that there is an opportunity for them to, for that to increase. I'm not sure that John's suggestion would really help the people who, at times like this, need the direct help from government in terms of either extra support and benefits or being able to actually find a job in the situation that's going to get them more money. I mean, we can't really overestimate the effect that the lockdown had on everything that's happening at the moment, because, I mean, even the railways wouldn't be in the way they are in the state if we hadn't had that lockdown. And there's no point going back and saying, well, we shouldn't have had the lockdown because it's happened. And I don't think there'll be anybody in a few years' time will ever say that they actually agreed with the lockdown. But that's another issue. You did.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, in 5 years you might not.
No, absolutely not. It was absolutely the right thing to do. John?
Essentially, I mean, some of us around this table have lived through other periods of very high inflation.
You're far too young.
Irrespective of what case
you were a child. You were a child at the time.
Oh, exactly. I wish. And, I'm no economist, but the classic way of dealing with that is fiscal and monetary tightening. And that is not going to happen, partly as a result of the pandemic, partly because this government is riven with division on this whole question of should it be a low tax or high spending conservative government. But the instincts are it's going to continue to try to spend its way out of it. If you then try to have wage settlements that match inflation, then you just have an inflationary spiral. And the extra point on all of this, partly caused by Brexit, partly caused by other factors, is a huge shortage of workers. So obviously the relationship between supply and demand and what workers can demand completely changes. So long and short of it is there do not seem to be the levers, however painful they were before, to get us out of this.
Do you think part of the problem is also that if you look around that cabinet table, I don't know how many of them are over the age of 50, but there aren't many. I mean, Boris Johnson is one of the older cabinet members. I think he's just turned 58. So there are comparatively few of them who lived through the inflation of the 1970s. And if you don't, who was it said, if you don't learn from history, you're destined to repeat it? Well, I think we are actually about to repeat what happened in the 1970s. The only saving grace at the moment is that unemployment is incredibly low. And obviously in the late 70s, it was starting to build. It hadn't reached its apex by any stretch of the imagination. But going back to John Inslow's question, this idea of a pay review, I mean, I imagine that the inflation rate in Uruguay was far higher than it is here now, or far higher than it's ever likely to get here. I mean, I've never heard this suggestion before, pay review every 3 months. It's the sort of thing you associate with basket case economies.
Our economy is in dire trouble. And I'm not talking it down. Just look at the stats. Look at the OECD stats. Look at the G7 stats. And as I say, we are struggling to find the levers to do that. But we've already talked about the inequity between private sector and public sector workers if you do go down that route. But it's going to be very difficult. And some people would say, well, that's a good thing. But it's going to be very difficult to keep wages down, because inflation is spiraling and people will otherwise be in even worse state than they are now. But just as you say, Iain, there isn't high unemployment. So you can't say, well, if you don't like it, you can go and get lost and join the dog queue, because there are not the workers to replace them.
Natalie, I know you're desperate to come in, but I just want to ask Phoebe, look, you are the youngest member of the panel. I'm slightly guessing here, but I'm thinking you're in your 20s.
Yeah, I'm 26.
Okay. I was right, thank God for that. I mean, inflation to somebody of your generation, unless you have studied the economics of the 1970s, it's difficult to imagine what the deleterious effects of inflation can be in all sorts of, not just in the economy, but in our personal lives. I mean, you look at mortgage rates. When I remember buying my first flat, and within 2 years, the mortgage rates were, I think, 12 to 14%. Well, just imagine that.
Yeah,
can you imagine that?
I sort of can, because it's something my parents talk about. My dad did live through the 70s and the inflation, and he's always spoken about it. And my mother is from Yugoslavia. It was a situation where her mother, a nurse, was sort of being paid in barrelfuls of potatoes at the local hospital. So I sort of have in that sense, and the idea of negative equity on mortgages. I mean, it's certainly very frightening. It is hard, probably, to imagine.
Natalie.
Well, I just wanted to come back to your comment of, the same levers in the 1970s. Of course, we're starting from a very different place. In the 1970s, we've been through the Great Levelling, where there'd actually been a really significant reduction in inequality. So what we've seen since then is an enormous leap of inequality. The wage share, the amount of money from the economy that's going to workers has gone down something like 14% since those times. So as John says, you can't use the levers then, because literally it would leave, I was going to say lots of people starving, but of course lots of people, a good million people regularly go to food banks because they haven't got enough money.
It's worse than that, because this is a global thing. If it was just this country that was experiencing inflation, you could think, well, the government might be able to do something about it meaningfully. But this is happening all over the world partly because of Ukraine, partly because, as you said, the supply chain crisis. And Gordon Brown has said that Boris Johnson should do what he did and call an international conference to coordinate this. I don't know what good that would do necessarily, but it's not something that the British government can solve on its own, is it?
Well, but what won't solve this is the economics that's governed government thinking around the world over the last 30 or 40 years, because that economics has clearly failed. We have a system that's really focused on saying, I'm afraid I'm going to come back to growth. We keep growing the economy, and so it gets bigger and bigger, and even people who are getting crumbs get a few more crumbs. What we have to do is acknowledge that the pie is a certain size, and we need to slice that pie up so that everybody has enough.
Okay. Right, we'll come to more of your questions in just a moment. It's 8:47.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
The biggest rail strike for 30 years. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps, how can peace break out?
I can see what's happening here, that their leader says he is nostalgic for the days of union power, and he's determined to try and turn himself back into one of those 1970s union barons, I think, and they need to get back round the table.
General Secretary of the RMT Union, Mick Lynch, just been described as a union baron.
They're escalating the issues rather than looking for settlements, and I think it's a provocation put together in Downing Street so that they can try and attack the RMT and attack railway workers who they seem to have a special dislike for.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 10 to 9 on LBC. We have John Kampfner, Kate Hoey, Natalie Bennett and Phoebe Arslanagic-Wakefield with us. Let's go to the next question. It's a text question from David in Preston. Vladimir Putin has threatened to deploy his Satan II nuclear missile by the end of the year. I've read it could reach the UK in 3 minutes, better than 45 or worse than 45. Should we be terrified? Should we threaten back? How should we react? Phoebe.
Well, I certainly am. I wouldn't say terrified. I certainly say it is a very frightening. Very frightening thought. I suppose we should react by continuing to maintain the pressure that we, along with the other members of the international community, have been doing. And actually that unity and that continued pressure on Russia is the way to go. And that's what's leading to posturing like this from Putin. That shows it's working.
At the beginning of the Ukraine war, a lot of people said, well, we shouldn't be poking the Russian bear. It's partly NATO's fault that this is happening in the first place. But when he makes remarks like this, there's got to be a strong reaction, hasn't there?
Yeah, I didn't agree with people who did say that. It does merit a strong reaction. Ultimately, Putin has been slowly pushing the envelope for a long time now, and we needed to draw a line, and it's good that we've done so and are standing by Ukraine.
Natalie.
Well, I think we have to look at where we are now and draw breath and say just how frightening, as Phoebe said, the current situation is. And it's not very long ago that the world and indeed the US Congress and the US military was worrying about the potential of Donald Trump using nuclear weapons. We cannot be secure while we have a world with nuclear weapons in it. It's an enormous danger. Actually, as we're speaking now, the first meeting of the parties of the UN Treaty for a global ban on nuclear weapons is meeting right now. And we have to get the world secure and safe from threats like this, we need a global ban on nuclear weapons.
You could argue that actually that's the last thing we need to do at the moment. If Ukraine had still had nuclear weapons, do you really think that Russia would have invaded? Surely we're much safer having nuclear weapons, because if we didn't, the Russian army said it's 2 million strong. Surely we would be in greater danger.
I can just point out the fallacy in your argument. You're saying if we had if we didn't have nuclear weapons, but we would be being threatened. We're being threatened now. Right now at this moment. And
but no one seriously believes that he's going to use them against us.
Well, I spoke to, we were talking about RUSI, the Royal United Services.
Sorry, John.
I was talking to an analyst from there. And of course, it is Russian military doctrine to use tactical battlefield so-called small nuclear weapons. And I asked this pretty mainstream analyst, what should we do if Russia uses a tactical small nuclear weapon in Ukraine? And his answer was that the world should not react militarily at all. And I said, how viable is that politically? And we just looked at each other and shrugged. We are in an extremely dangerous situation. The UK has 1% of the world's nuclear weapons. If we were to step out and say, we have to break through on this, we will join the treaty, the global treaty to ban nuclear weapons. Then we would have a huge positive. John's talking about our place in the world. We would suddenly be an absolute world leader in delivering a secure world.
John Kampfner, I interviewed Ben Judah a couple of months ago at the beginning of this war. And it was at a time, I can't remember the exact circumstances, but he was telling me that he's based in New York, he'd talked to various people in Washington, and the US government had done lots of studies, they'd war gamed what could happen. And to cut a long story short, their conclusion in 8 different scenarios was that Britain would be the target of a limited nuclear strike, which... When I heard him say this, I sent a shiver down my spine. And so despite what I just said to Natalie there, that we can't imagine him using it, clearly that could be a possibility.
Well, first of all, Iain, I mean, just by way of brief preamble, I'm so old. I was a young correspondent in Moscow in the mid-'80s. When Chernobyl happened and when Gorbachev was trying to do reforms. I was there for 5 years at the start of the 90s, where we all dared to be incredibly optimistic, and I was. I loved the place, and I was so... You just saw changes happen all the time. What has happened, not immediately when Putin came in power in 2000, but certainly I remember seeing him and going to see him in 2004, and this was a moment where I was talking to Jack Straw about afterwards, where he really turned... And from then all the way through to 2014 and beyond, he has just steadily but exponentially got more and more dangerous. Everything we've been talking about this evening with strikes and British politics and everything else pales into insignificance on this. This is absolutely, by a factor of 100, the biggest danger to all of us, to our peace, our security, and our lifestyles. RUSI is a great think tank, by the way. I've done some work for them. We did yesterday at Chatham House a behind closed doors all-day seminar on Russia, Ukraine, and what should Britain's policy be. One of the really important factors is how do you deal with this threat, with this nuclear threat? Putin is very happy to put it about the whole time. Oh, we could use this, we could use this. The problem with it is you can't gauge the degree to which it is a very useful threat. Don't mess with us anymore because you never know when I might do it. And to what extent Putin could actually do it. Could he do it in a tactical sense? In Ukraine itself, he's certainly been cavalier when it's come to attacks on nuclear stations and other respects. So in other words, is he bad? Is he mad? Does it matter between the two? And I must say there is a possibility, and I think we should, it's horrible because they don't know what to do with that prospect. Because it's just fear without any sense of ownership, without any sense of knowing what you could do. But such is the situation. It is possible that he could do it. He could do it locally, so to speak, in short-range nuclear tactical battlefield weapons. He could do it medium range, which means Britain whether Britain is more of a target than other European countries is moot. But he could do it. Then how do you respond? And absolutely, my view, Natalie, I disagree with you on this. My view is to be absolutely resolute. That Europe needs to be resolute. The transatlantic relationship, one of the good byproducts of this is that the transatlantic relationship has got stronger. NATO has got stronger. NATO has shown its colours. It's not brain dead, as Macron once described it. And it's one of those devil or the deep blue sea questions. It is frightening. But I think if we buckled on the fear of nuclear weapons, it would just only encourage Putin further.
Okay, Harry.
Well, I'm a lot older than John, and I can remember the fear even as a younger person at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, that brought real fear. So I was
afraid, and I was only 6 months old.
Yeah, I thought everybody on the panel
1 year, 6 months.
won't remember it. But I tend to agree with John because I think while we would all like to get rid of nuclear weapons, just talking about it and having discussions like that is not going to happen. I mean, the reality is Russia at this stage is certainly not going to give up any of its nuclear weapons. And even if they said they were going to, I wouldn't feel that I could trust them. So I don't think we're in a situation where the idealistic way of looking at it is going to help. I think what we have to do is keep up the economic pressure, the sanctions, all of that on Russia. And gradually, I have great confidence in the people of Russia themselves because I can't believe that as they finally find out more and more about what's happening and how many of their people they're losing, in soldiers, the deaths, the family bereavements that are happening, that won't change if we can get them to do something. But I agree with that. If there was a strike, we have to be determined to show that we would not just simply.
Final word on this from David in Horsham. If Putin's atomic weapons work as well as the rest of his army, we have little to be afraid of. Now, final text from Caroline in Kettering. Mick Lynch looks like Iain Dale, or is it Iain Dale that looks like Mick Lynch? Who is your celebrity look-alike? Or sound-alike, maybe. I've got a sound-alike, apparently. I can't hear it, but apparently I sound just like Rick Stein. So many people have said it, it must be true. Any of you got a sound-alike or a look-alike? John Kampfner.
Brad Pitt.
No.
Kate?
No, not that I've been told, anyway.
Oh, that's a boring answer.
Yeah, I know it's boring, sorry.
Okay. Well, I can't think of anyone that you particularly look like, I must admit. Natalie, can you do better?
Not a great deal better, but I do notice that, whenever people come up to me and say, I heard you and I realised it was you. So I believe my very distinctive voice is definitely the thing that stands out about me.
Yeah, Olivia Newton-John.
I'd take it if I were you.
Yeah, I'll take that. Yeah.
Phoebe.
I mean, Keira Knightley and I mean, we both have brown hair, perhaps there may be more.
Kind of see that.
Also brown eyes.
Yeah. No, we'll go with that.
Are you polite or sold on it? I'm not sure.
I'm not saying. Right, thank you very much indeed to all of you. John Kampfner, Kate Hoey, Natalie Bennett and Phoebe Arslanagic-Wakefield. I got it right in the end. Right, in the next hour, we are going to turn our attention to family feuds. We've all experienced them, haven't we? Well, Elon Musk's 18-year-old daughter has legally changed her name to disassociate herself from her billionaire father. Have you been involved in a family feud? Has it lasted for decades? Has the passage of time slightly softened things? Did you manage to reconcile? What's been your experience of feuds? 0345 6060 973. And we can, of course, change your name if you like. It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.